Hi there. In this lecture we see one of my all-time favourite Tigran Petrosian games. This is against Boris Spassky in the 1966 Petrosian-Spassky World Championship match. This is round 10. So knight f3 from Petrosian. Spassky plays knight f6, g3, g6, c4. So we transpose into a King's Indian defence, the fianchetto variation. So white castling here, knight c6, knight c3, d6, d4, a6, d5. We see knight a5, knight d2, c5. So this is a very popular setup by black in the King's Indian against the fianchetto variation. Black's trying to sometimes create queenside counterplay. We see queen c2, e5. Quite often here rook b8 is played, not yet committing to e5. So for example b3, b5, and if bishop b2, play often continues like this with b takes, bishop h6. So sometimes threatening to take, and then knight takes c4, f4, e5, d takes e6 en passant, bishop takes e6, knight d5, and games have continued from here. White's thought to have a small edge here. Okay, a small edge there. So anyway, we see e5 instead, b3, and now knight g4. So again, quite often rook b8 here is played with that b5 plan here. So for example, this situation has been seen before. But knight g4 immediately, e4, h3 is also kind of interesting. The knight maybe goes back to h6. That would be in line with black wanting to play f5. So say e4, f5. White can actually just take on f5. Anytime a piece takes on f5, we can use the e4 square, a nice blockade on e4. So say g takes, bishop b2. This is also, it's quite a nice advantage for white here. So anyway, e4 is played, just leaving the knight on g4, f5, and now e takes is played here, g takes. So if bishop takes again, you know, this is a King's Indian kind of theme, trying to get a blockading knight on e4, and white does have a nice advantage there. It shuts in that bishop on g7. Okay, so g takes is played. Knight d1. Now this seems as though it's a little bit passive from Petrosian, but he is keen potentially to try and weaken actually the squares around the opponent's king, not occupy them, initially just try and weaken them. Maybe that's the golden thing about this game in terms of attacking chess. Sometimes you want to provoke weaknesses around the opponent's king, and then you want to get pieces installed later. We see b5. One of the points of knight d1 is that it controls the e3 square, and it means actually that we have two options now for kicking this knight. We can basically kick it with h3 or f3 because we're controlling e3 now, and actually Petrosian prefers f3, but things get quite violent now. Basically, we see actually e4, so counterattacking this rook, bishop b2, and now e takes f3. So an interesting situation. Black, Spassky has fragmented his pawns here, but he's looking to blast this open and liberate the bishop and sometimes get key squares for his queen. We see bishop takes b2. This is the first sign that actually there are some square weaknesses though around the king emerging, so look out for that vacuum. And the knight actually, now one of the perks of the way Spassky's played it is to get a nicely perched knight on e5. Now generally that is very, very good to get. We see the bishop actually going to e2, so it's helping safeguard c4 along with this knight, but also that bishop, one day sometimes bishop g4 to e6 might be possible, and you might think, well, that's That's never going to happen. But what would need to happen for that to happen, if you think about it? That pawn would not have to be there. This is knight, this knight and this bishop. But imagine if you did get this, let's dream here tactically, we'd have this complementary kind of situation where the queen would be controlling the dark squares and the bishop on the light squares. Now, Spassky is very concerned with, maximizing his attacking potential here. Before we get into the rest of the game, if we look at bishop g2 for a moment, yeah, b takes c4 seems as though this is really, really dumb. But actually, white can actually play knight e3 here. This is a very dynamic thing to consider. And if c takes, a takes, that knight's a little bit vulnerable. And if rook b8, queen c3, rook b4 to try and stop the knight being munched. Knight c2, black can play this. And it's a very interesting position. So it takes check, winning the queen. It's a very interesting situation, but it turns out white should have a small edge here. It doesn't look very principled at all to do that. So it does seem as though putting the bishop on e2 is very, very logical to safeguard c4, to keep a nice, smooth pawn structure intact. And the bishop fundamentally is looking at both sides of the board. So sometimes the bishop is actually useful for hammering b5 at some point. But yes, it's a flexible, centralized bishop. So it's interesting to consider. If indeed, by the way, b takes c4, then we are in big trouble. Black takes on c4. And that's just great for black. So anyway, yeah, the dynamic things behind the scenes. So bishop e2, though, it seems extremely logical. And now f4, this is starting to seem really dangerous in a way, because black does have some very, very interesting resources trying to weaken white's dark squares here. If queen e7, then c takes b5 and maybe bishop takes b5 is plausible. For example, this situation, d5 can be held. This is just against any tactics, like cheeky tactics like knight f3. It seems white can get a very interesting position, and a pawn sec over here is very dynamic. This is nice for white. But anyway, f4, very vicious. We see g takes f4. Another move which is good here is actually, it seems, rook takes f4 is plausible. If rook takes, g takes, knight g6, knight e4, and we can see that this vacuum of weaknesses is kind of interesting. So knight takes f4, knight df2. This situation looks as though black's king is a little bit precarious, with the threat of knight f6 check winning the queen. Let's say rook f8, queen c3 looking at that knight. If bishop takes first, it seems as though knight takes c5 here hits the queen, and this is a great position for white. So queen c3 not just hit the knight, also protected the rook, so facilitating this tactic here. But anyway, in the game actually, g takes f4 was played. And we have actually bishop h3 being played. And here the game really turns into amazing magic territory. Guess what Petrosian plays in this position? For 100 points. Okay, and when I originally covered this on YouTube, I called it like hijacking diagonals. It seems that bishop is protecting key diagonals in the position. And Petrosian just sacrifices the exchange, knight e3. Wonderful stuff. If he plays f takes e5, by the way, that's a total disaster. That's a weakness of the last move. g5 is available. Queen g5, and then, mating. So knight e3, very powerful exchange sack. So we have it being accepted. Rook takes f1, knight g6, and the point is now it's like getting onto those diagonals. That's why I originally themed this, hijacking diagonals. It seems as though, hang on, what has gone on here? White's now really installing pieces around the king. First it was like weakening squares around the king, and now it's like near occupation. So knight takes f4 is played, but isn't the occupation prevented? The knight could take on e6. So knight takes f4 does seem extremely logical and blasts open some dark squares. If rook takes f4, then bishop e6 check, rook takes f4 check, there's queen h8 check, and then here knight f5 is checkmate. So black does have to tread carefully. If queen h4, then bishop e6 check, knight e4, and here if knight takes f4, then bishop takes f7, king h1 is strong, and this is quite the position indeed. After knight takes d6 check, that's crushing. And you might wonder, hold on, well, forget rook e8, what about rook f8? The point is knight f5. You can see things are installing near the king. So say queen g4 to look at after g7, but then f6, queen f6, and then knight h6, brutal, is checkmate. Or if king e8, queen e7. So I think we're really bearing witness to this kind of process that quite often Petrosian is first creating a vacuum around the opponent's king and then going in for the kill, occupying around the territory, around the squares of the opponent's king. So one of my more primitive strategies when I won the Lloyd's Bank Under 18 UK tournament in 1989, I was trying to think about using my best resources on squares around the opponent's king. Now this is a bit more refined. This is first softening up the squares around the king, making sure there's a vacuum, sacrificing if needed an exchange, making sure there's a vacuum, and now that there's a vacuum, then occupy the squares around the opponent's king. So a bit more refined than a more primitive strategy. So what do we do here if we want an installation near the king? So 100 points here, what would you play in this position? Yeah, it becomes another exchange sacrifice, 2 exchange sacrifices. Wonderful stuff. So we get access to this lovely e6 square, and black has to go into a self-pin. If king f8, then queen h8 check, king e7, queen takes h7 check, and this is looking pretty nasty. If king f6, queen f7 check, king e5, queen g7 check, queen f6, queen g3. The king's not lasting too long here. If, say, king d4, knight c2 check, queen e3 check, queen takes e4, the king's not very happy being there. If rook f8, knight g4 check, and then rook queen e3 is checkmate. Forget taking the queen. So yeah, it's all very, very dangerous, this scenario. So this self-pin is needed. Okay, but still, white is 2 exchanges down, right? Equal on pawns. But now we have knight e4. So there are big ideas in this position. And we see Spassky playing queen h4, which seems kind of logical to hit the knight. And also, try and dissuade knight f5. If, for example, b takes c4 instead, knight f5 is the big thing. Where, can you see what the major threat is? The power of the pin piece or pawn is illusionary. So what is white's major threat on c takes b3 for 100 points? Yeah? It's queen g7 is checkmate. So yeah, it seems as though, queen h4 is trying to look after, knight f5 and queen g7 checkmate. But there is a weakness of the last move. It does neglect d6. And by the way, in case you're wondering about that other variation, just there's one more thing about this I wanted to show you. After knight f5, so yes, the threat is queen g7. So you might ask, well, hang on, Kingscrusher, what about queen f8? Well, what does white play here, which shows a bit more vividly that idea that once there's a vacuum, you want to install yourself near to the opponent's king. So what is the move which installs another major resource near the opponent's king here, which is really quite crushing for 100 points? Okay, there is a move which is crushing, queen f6. It means here that, you know, knight h6 is supported, which would win the queen. So that's totally, you know, brutally crushing. So, okay. So back to the game. Queen h4. We have knight takes d6. And Spassky tries queen g5 check here. We have king h1. And it looks as though, hold on, what about this knight on e3? Rook a to a7 is played. The reason is if queen takes e3, then bishop takes f7 check. And the queen is in an unfortunate place, actually. After queen h8 check, king e7, we can actually fork the king and queen. But mind you, you might ask, well, hold on, the rook's attacking our queen. The thing is, king d7, what does white play here, which is cute? Okay, we don't take the queen, that would blur everything. We play bishop e6 check. We want to be able to check the king and then take the queen. So say king c7, you know, queen takes h7 check, and then we take the queen. So, okay, that knight can't be taken. So we have rook a7. But now there's an absolutely glorious finish. Can you see this finishing combination for 1,000 points? It's one of the most beautiful, in my view, of Tigran Petrosian. Actually, let's make it 10,000 points. It is one of the most beautiful. So you might want to pause the video here. It really captured my imagination for, you know, Petrosian's tactical chess, actually. And this course, you know, the games we're looking at are quite a lot of the more tactical, shorter games of Petrosian. But this is the one that really caught my imagination about Tigran. And, you know, once got me to, you know, really want to explore further his other masterpieces. So in fact, you know, this is an interest creator for Petrosian overall for me. This is a fantastic advert for his style of play. Okay, so the combination, I'm about to reveal how it starts. Check all checks, no matter how outrageous. But the first one is bishop takes f7 check. Rook takes f7. Now, if ever there was a position where checking all checks, no matter how ridiculously outrageous, this is the kind of situation where it's really helpful to see certain completely crazy looking checks. You know, in the Morphy days, they think if you played something like this, they'd probably try and lock you up, check your sanity. But it works very well. So this next move, the insane, about to reveal, queen h8, divine, beautiful, absolutely stunning, crushing, tactically brilliant move, queen h8, check. And that ends the game. If king takes h8, not too many options, limits the opponent's replies. Knight takes f7 check. Knight takes g5, we're a piece up. And pass pawn here, easily winning. So takeaway points. I mean, I've visited this game several times. in the past. But one that stands out for me now, it's not just the notion of hijacking diagonals, it's about trying to weaken the opponent's king in subtle ways. You know, they can go and attack you, they can leave things behind. They're putting themselves, you know, in a risky position, not beyond defeat. So you're waiting for that signal that the opponent is not beyond defeat because they've got this vacuum of weaknesses. And then you consider very creative stuff to try and get in there with your pieces, get your best resources on squares around the opponent's king, but after there's definite signs that there's a vacuum. So it's a wonderfully provocative game. And it taught Spassky a lesson, you know, that he made one of the interesting, you know, metaphors about Petrosian being like a spiky hedgehog, you know, putting up the spikes when a hedgehog is under attack. Because Spassky is quite an attacking player, and yeah, he kind of went for it in this game, but yes, his weaknesses were exposed. So very, very interesting game, and quite often you may have experienced this. You know, some players, they seem to, you know, get you to want to attack them, and you've left, you know, squares behind around your king, and it seems, oh, really, they've provoked me to just weaken my king, and then they pounce. Yeah, it's really quite a common attacking strategy. Try and encourage a vacuum of weaknesses around the king, then pounce later. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this one and found it pretty instructive. Thanks so much.